Chapter 1. An Urgent Summons. The relentless drizzle of a late autumn evening drummed against the carriage windows as Detective Jane Parsons peered out into the gas-lit streets of London. The lamps, their flickering glow barely penetrating the thick fog rolling in from the Thames, cast ghostly shadows on the cobbled roads. It was a night suited to intrigue, and Jane knew well that an urgent summons at this hour meant something of considerable gravity. She glanced once more at the note she had received not an hour earlier, a hastily written missive delivered by a footman in impeccable livery. The handwriting was unmistakably Lord Arthur Pendleton's, sharp, elegant, and underlined with urgency. "Detective Parsons, your presence is required at once at Pendleton House. A most distressing matter has occurred, one that demands absolute discretion. I trust you shall come with all haste. Lord Arthur Pendleton." Jane sighed, tucking the note into her coat pocket. Lord Pendleton was not a man easily rattled. A former diplomat and well-respected figure among London's elite, he had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of international relations. If he sought her help, it meant something truly dire had transpired. The carriage jolted as it turned onto Park Lane, drawing up before the grand Pendleton house. The imposing front door swung open before her foot even touched the ground, revealing a liveried butler whose lined face betrayed uncharacteristic worry. "This way, madam," he murmured, leading her through the grand entrance hall. The house, usually a place of quiet dignity, felt unnaturally tense. Servants moved in hushed whispers, their faces clouded with unease. Jane's sharp eyes took in every detail as she was ushered into Lord Pendleton's private study. The room was lined with dark mahogany shelves stacked with legal tomes and diplomatic archives. At the centre stood a vast oak desk, its surface meticulously arranged, except for a single dishevelled section near the edge, where several papers lay scattered. Behind the desk, Lord Arthur Pendleton rose as she entered. Though still an imposing figure, his face was pale, the deep lines of age more pronounced than usual. He gestured to a chair opposite him. "Detective Parsons," he said, his voice grave, "I wish our meeting were under better circumstances." Jane sat, looking at him with a calm, assessing gaze. "Your note suggested urgency. Tell me, Lord Pendleton, what has happened?" He exhaled, pressing his fingers together. "A theft, Miss Parsons, but not just any theft." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Highly sensitive diplomatic documents pertaining to the Anglo-American submarine treaty have vanished." "From where?" Jane inquired. "From the Pendleton house vault," he said, his expression darkening. "A vault considered impregnable." The Pendleton vault was famed for its security, designed to hold only the most confidential of governmental and diplomatic documents before their secure dispatch overseas. If someone had breached it, this was no ordinary burglary. "When were the documents last seen?" she asked. "Last evening," Lord Pendleton answered. "I personally verified them. This morning, when I prepared to have them sealed for secure transport to America, they were gone." Jane leaned back slightly. Who had access to the vault? Pendleton's face tightened. "Only a handful of individuals, trusted men who have served my household and the Crown for years. And yet, someone among them must be responsible." Jane absorbed this in silence. A crime like this was not one of impulse. It required forethought, knowledge, and an intimate understanding of Pendleton House's operations. "I shall need to see the vault," she said. "Of course." Lord Pendleton stood, leading her through the halls with purposeful strides. As they reached the heavy iron door of the vault, Jane could feel the weight of the case settling over her. This was no ordinary theft. Someone had taken extraordinary risks to steal these papers. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The thick iron-wrought door of the vault loomed ahead, its surface cold and unyielding under the dim glow of a wall-mounted lantern. Jane approached with measured steps, her sharp gaze taking in every detail of the chamber. If the vault had been forced open, she would expect broken locks or warped hinges. But as she ran a gloved hand along the door's edges, there were no signs of force. The vault had not been broken into, it had been opened. Behind her, Lord Arthur Pendleton shifted uneasily. Though he had recovered his composure, his deep-set eyes betrayed a storm of emotions, anger, suspicion, and, above all, an unspoken fear of the implications. "You are certain no one could have tampered with the locking mechanism?" Jane asked, stepping back. "Quite certain," Pendleton replied. "The vault requires not only a key, but also a unique code, one that I alone know." Jane looked at him sharply. "No one else?" Pendleton hesitated. "Only one other person has ever handled the documents within the vault. My private secretary, Victor Halliday. He does not have the code, but I have, on occasion, had him assist in cataloguing documents once I've opened the door." Jane made a mental note of this. Halliday's name was the first on her list. She crouched down, examining the floor near the vault entrance. The marble tiles were spotless, no obvious footprints or disturbed dust. However, something caught her eye. A faint smudge near the threshold, as though someone had hastily scuffed their boot against the floor. Rising, she entered the vault. Inside, the chamber was lined with iron shelves, each one meticulously labelled with small brass plaques indicating the contents. Pendleton had been precise in his descriptions. This was a repository for sensitive documents, treaties, and diplomatic correspondence, all neatly arranged in bound folders. Jane's gaze settled on an empty space along the central shelf. "This is where the treaty was kept?" Pendleton nodded. "Locked inside a steel case." Jane frowned. "And the case itself? Gone? Tell me about the people who had access to this room, or knowledge of the treaty's presence," she said. Pendleton's lips pressed into a thin line. "I have already given the matter much thought. There are 4 individuals who, while not directly in possession of the code, had the means, or at least the opportunity, to orchestrate this theft." He led her out of the vault, down the corridor, and into a high-ceilinged drawing-room where a fire burned low in the grate. He poured himself a brandy, but did not drink it. "I have spent my life among men of rank and repute," he said quietly, "but I am not blind to the ambitions that lurk in the hearts of even the most trusted." He turned to Jane. "Allow me to introduce the 4 who warrant your scrutiny." Victor Halliday, the ambitious private secretary. A man of sharp intellect and precise manner, Victor Halliday had served as Pendleton's right hand for several years. He was responsible for drafting and managing sensitive correspondence and had knowledge of nearly every diplomatic affair passing through Pendleton's hands. Though he lacked direct access to the vault, he was one of the few who knew of the treaty's existence. "He is an invaluable aid," Pendleton admitted, "but I would be a fool to ignore his ambitions. Victor has long desired a position within the Foreign Office. A man with such aspirations might see the possession of sensitive documents as a means to propel himself forward." Jane made a note of Halliday's name. A man in his position would certainly have the motive, whether for leverage, financial gain, or political advancement. Eleanor Fitzroy, the sharp-witted niece. Eleanor was Lord Pendleton's niece, a woman of keen intelligence and even sharper wit. She had spent much of her upbringing under his roof, though her independent nature had led her to forge her own path. Known for her keen interest in political matters, she was one of the few people with unfettered access to her uncle's study. "She is perceptive," Pendleton admitted, "perhaps too much for her own good. I do not wish to suspect her, but Eleanor has a mind that could unravel secrets many would struggle to comprehend." Jane tapped her fingers against the arm of her chair. Could Eleanor have taken the documents for ideological reasons? Or had she stumbled upon something by accident? Major Henry Blake, the military liaison. Major Henry Blake, a decorated officer, had been assigned as a military liaison to oversee the transport of the treaty. He was a man of rigid discipline, yet his presence in Pendleton's household had been an unexpected one. His orders were to ensure the document's safety, Pendleton said, yet the fact remains that he was in the house at the time of the theft. Jane frowned. If Blake had wanted to steal the documents, he would have had to act quickly. But was a military man capable of such subterfuge? Or had he been working under someone else's orders? Isabel Gardner, the enigmatic guest. Isabel Gardner was a woman of mystery. A reputed international socialite, she had arrived in London only weeks earlier, her name whispered among circles of power. Her reputation was one of charm and influence, yet Jane knew that such figures often harboured hidden agendas. "She has dined at my table and attended my gatherings," Pendleton said, "but I do not believe for a moment that her interest in London is purely social." Jane's brow furrowed. A woman like Isabel could have powerful connections. If the theft had an international dimension, she might very well be the key to unlocking it. Jane folded her arms as she considered the suspects. 4 people, each with a reason, whether personal, professional, or political, to want their hands on the treaty. "One of them is responsible," Pendleton murmured. Jane's eyes darkened with determination. "Or 2, she said. Pendleton looked at her sharply. If this was an inside job, it is possible the thief did not act alone. She stood, fastening her coat. "I will speak with each of them, Lord Pendleton. But first, I wish to see their rooms and their movements on the night of the theft." Pendleton nodded, summoning his butler. "I shall see to it at once." Jane glanced back at the vault's iron door. Someone had been clever enough to bypass its defences. Now she needed to be clever enough to unravel their deception. Chapter 3. Secrets and Suspicions. The fire in the drawing-room of the Pendleton house crackled low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the polished wood panelling. Jane stood by the tall windows, watching the gas-lit street beyond as she gathered her thoughts. She turned from the window, glancing at Lord Pendleton, who sat stiffly in his armchair. "I will need to speak to each suspect individually," she said. Pendleton nodded. "They are all aware of the situation and have been asked to remain in the house. I trust you will find what you need." Jane inclined her head, then turned to the butler. "Bring Mr. Halliday to the study." Victor Halliday, the ambitious private secretary. Victor Halliday entered with a composed air, his neatly pressed suit and perfectly arranged cravat suggesting a man who prided himself on control. Yet Jane did not miss the slight tension in his jaw as he took a seat across from her. "You've been Lord Pendleton's private secretary for some time now, Mr. Halliday," Jane began. 5 years, he answered smoothly. "A position I have fulfilled with diligence." "You must have known about the treaty," she said. Halliday hesitated only a fraction of a second before answering. "Of course, I draft much of Lord Pendleton's correspondence, but I had no reason to concern myself with the documents once they were locked away." Jane studied him carefully. "Ambition is a powerful motivator, Mr. Halliday. A man in your position, privy to sensitive information, could find himself in great favour if he had something valuable to offer." A flicker of something crossed his eyes. Resentment? Amusement? "You imply I would betray my employer for personal gain," he said, his voice clipped. "I assure you, Miss Parsons, my loyalty is unwavering." "And yet," Jane continued, "you have made no secret of your desire for a higher position. Perhaps a well-placed bribe or the right connections could help you advance." He stiffened. I have worked tirelessly for my career, but I am no traitor. Jane let the words hang between them, then said, Where were you last night, between 10 and midnight? In my quarters, drafting letters for Lord Pendleton. Can anyone confirm this? The housekeeper, Mrs. Graves, brought me tea around 11. She can vouch for my presence. Jane made a note of it. Halliday had a motive, but for now his alibi held. Eleanor Fitzroy, the niece with hidden burdens. Eleanor Fitzroy entered the study with a confident stride, her emerald dress a striking contrast against the dark wood furnishings. She sat down, folding her hands in her lap, her expression unreadable. I understand you have a keen interest in politics, Jane said. Eleanor arched an eyebrow. I would hardly be an educated woman if I did not. Your uncle trusts you, Jane observed. You have access to his study. You could have known about the treaty. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Detective, my uncle has many documents. I do not make it a habit to rifle through them. Jane smiled faintly. You were seen speaking with a man outside the house 2 nights ago. A debt collector, I believe. For the first time, Eleanor's composure faltered. That is none of your concern. On the contrary, Jane said, leaning forward, if you are in financial difficulty, the prospect of selling valuable information might have been tempting. Eleanor's lips thinned. I do not deny my financial troubles, detective. My late father left behind debts, and I have struggled to keep them from affecting my uncle. But I am no thief. Where were you last night between 10 and midnight? In the drawing-room reading. Major Blake passed by around 11. He can confirm it. Jane took note. Eleanor had a strong motive, but was her alibi solid? Major Henry Blake, the disgraced officer. Major Henry Blake arrived with a crisp military posture, his uniform immaculate despite his increasingly frayed reputation. He offered a sharp nod as he took a seat. Major Blake, your role in the security of the treaty is well documented, Jane said. Yet you have had difficulties in recent years. Blake's jaw tightened. You mean my court-martial? Jane met his gaze evenly. A tactical failure in India led to your disgrace, did it not? Blake's fingers twitched, but he nodded. I was blamed, yes. I have spent years trying to regain my standing. A missing treaty would put you in a precarious position, Jane said. Or did you see this as an opportunity to barter, perhaps, for the restoration of your name? Blake's fists clenched. I am no traitor. Where were you last night between 10 and midnight? In the smoking room with Halliday until 10:30. Then I retired to my room. Jane made a note of it. But if Halliday was in his study, who could confirm Blake's whereabouts after 10:30? Isabel Gardner, the enigmatic socialite. Isabel Gardner swept into the study like a queen entering court. Clad in a flowing gown of deep blue, she exuded effortless charm. But Jane knew better than to be taken in by a well-crafted performance. Miss Gardner, Jane said smoothly, your travels have brought you to many interesting places. Paris, Vienna, Constantinople, and now London. Isabel smiled. A woman must see the world, must she not? Or gather information, Jane countered. Isabel's smile did not waver, but something in her eyes sharpened. Surely you don't suspect me of espionage, detective? Jane tapped a finger against her notebook. You were in the house the night the treaty disappeared. Where were you between 10 and midnight? In the library, Isabel replied lightly. Lord Pendleton himself saw me there before he retired. And after that? Isabel's eyes twinkled with amusement. Alone, but I assure you I was exactly where I claimed to be. By the time Jane finished her interrogations, the pieces of the puzzle had begun to shift, but no single image emerged. Victor Halliday had ambition but claimed a solid alibi. Eleanor Fitzroy had financial troubles but was seen in the drawing room. Major Blake had a reputation to salvage but was unaccounted for after 10:30. Isabel Gardner was too clever by half and had no witness after Lord Pendleton left the library. Jane tapped her pen against the table. Each had motive, each had opportunity, but their alibis, however credible, did not clear them entirely. She closed her notebook and exhaled. Chapter 4. A Trail Emerges. The study at Pendleton House was silent except for the occasional scratch of Jane Parsons's pen against her notebook. The interviews had yielded much, suspicions, motives, and alibis that did not quite fit together. But none of it was proof. Proof, however, often came in the smallest of details. She reached into her pocket and retrieved the fragment of paper she had discovered near the vault, a torn corner of an encrypted telegram, its edges crisp as though it had been recently torn. The ink was smudged, but faint markings were still visible. Firmed. 12. Docks. P.M. Thurs. Jane turned the scrap over, feeling the weight of significance in the little slip of paper. A telegram, a clandestine meeting, and a location. She leaned forward, spreading a blank sheet of paper on the desk. "Lord Pendleton," she said, "have you or your staff sent or received any telegrams in the last day?" Pendleton frowned. "None that I am aware of. My communications are usually handled by Halliday, but he would have no reason to keep something like this from me." Jane's mind was spinning, unless, of course, the telegram was never meant for Lord Pendleton at all. She picked up her magnifying glass and held it over the scrap, scanning for more details. The font was standard for telegraphs sent from the Royal Telegraph Office, a central hub for coded and urgent messages. The ink, still dark, suggested it had been sent no more than a day or two ago. Docks, 12 p.m. Thursday. She exhaled slowly. A meeting, a transfer, perhaps even the handoff of the stolen documents. Standing abruptly, she turned to Pendleton. "I will need to visit the telegraph office immediately." The office was a hub of frantic energy, clerks scurrying from desk to desk, dispatching telegrams bound for all corners of the empire. Jane approached the front counter, flashing her official identification as a private investigator. "I need to examine recent telegrams sent within the last 24 hours, she said briskly. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, hesitated before nodding. "Of course, madam. Any particular destination?" Jane slid the scrap of paper across the counter. "I believe this was part of a message sent here. Can you match the handwriting?" The clerk adjusted his spectacles, scanning the fragment before flipping through a ledger of outgoing messages. After a few tense minutes, he stopped, tapping the page. "This message was sent late last night," he said. "It was encrypted." "Encrypted?" Jane frowned. "Standard for sensitive communications," the clerk explained. "Military, government, high-priority affairs. But this one," he lowered his voice, "was sent from here, but the sender's identity was obscured." "Can you decipher it?" Jane asked. The clerk hesitated. "That would require official clearance." Jane leaned forward. "Consider this an official investigation." He sighed but nodded, retrieving a codebook from a locked cabinet. After some effort, he managed to reconstruct a portion of the message. "Confirming rendezvous, docks, midnight, payment secured, awaiting handoff." Jane's grip on the paper tightened. The stolen documents were to be exchanged at the docks. Tonight. Without another word, she turned on her heel and strode out into the fog-laden streets of London. The London docks at midnight were a world unto themselves, a labyrinth of warehouses, towering cranes, and ships shifting in the cold, inky waters of the Thames. Fog clung to the cobbled pathways, swirling around the gas lamps that cast pale, flickering light over the desolate wharf. Jane had chosen her vantage point carefully, an abandoned storage shed overlooking a narrow alleyway leading to the river. It was the perfect place for a secret exchange. She adjusted the brim of her hat, keeping to the shadows as she observed the scene before her. If the treaty was truly here, someone would come to collect it. The hours ticked by. Midnight came. Then, just as she began to think the meeting had been called off, a faint movement caught her eye. A lone figure emerged from the mist. The man was tall, draped in a heavy coat, his hat pulled low over his face. He moved with purpose, pausing beneath a gas lamp and glancing around before signalling toward the docks. A second figure emerged. This one was shorter, wrapped in a dark cloak, moving quickly and deliberately. They exchanged hushed words. Jane strained to hear. "The papers?" one of them muttered. A hand extended, a bundle of papers barely visible in the lamplight. The treaty. Jane stepped forward, ready to intercept. But at that precise moment, a sharp whistle cut through the night air. The two figures startled. The taller man shoved the papers into his coat and bolted toward the riverbank. The cloaked figure turned on their heel and fled in the opposite direction. Jane sprinted forward, her boots striking the slick stone as she pursued the taller man. He veered toward a waiting rowing boat, clearly intent on escaping by water. Not if I can stop him, Jane thought. With a burst of speed, she grabbed for his coat, just as he swung around, throwing a punch. Jane ducked, twisting to the side, and kicked out with her boot, knocking him off balance. He stumbled, catching himself against the dock railing. In that instant, Jane saw his face. Victor Halliday! Her mind raced. Halliday! But had he been acting alone? Before she could react further, he leapt into the boat and pushed off, vanishing into the fog. Jane exhaled sharply. The trail had not ended. It had only just begun. As Jane made her way back through the misty streets, her mind churned. Halliday had been at the docks. He had been part of the exchange. But was he the orchestrator, or merely the middleman? And most importantly, who had he been meeting? A name still eluded her. Chapter 5. Shadows at the Docks. Jane Parsons adjusted the collar of her coat, pressing herself deeper into the shadows of a stack of wooden crates as she observed the unfolding scene before her. A woman, tall, elegant, and unmistakably Isabel Gardner, stood beneath the dim glow of a gas lamp. Her dark cloak swayed slightly in the cold wind, but she remained perfectly still, her gloved hands clenched at her sides. Opposite her, partially obscured by the fog, was a man. His broad-shouldered silhouette and heavy overcoat marked him as someone cautious, someone who wished to remain unseen. Jane narrowed her eyes. Isabel, meeting a stranger at the docks, at midnight. The implications were too clear to ignore. She edged closer, careful not to make a sound as she strained to hear their conversation. The man's voice was low, but his words carried in the stillness. "I warned you not to delay, Miss Gardner. You should have brought what I asked for." Jane saw Isabel's fingers twitch, as though resisting the urge to strike out. "I told you before," Isabel replied in a sharp whisper. "I don't have it. I never had it." The man let out a short, humourless chuckle. "I don't believe you. You're too well connected not to have access. I don't need your excuses, Miss Gardner. I need what was promised." Jane's mind whirred. Promised? Had Isabel agreed to something? Was she acting as a courier? Or had she simply been caught up in something much larger than herself? Isabel's voice dropped lower, but Jane could still hear the controlled fury in her tone. "You're mistaken if you think you can intimidate me." The man stepped forward, his shadow stretching ominously in the gaslight. "I think you'll find I can, unless, of course, you want certain letters to find their way into the wrong hands." A long pause. Jane's breath caught. Blackmail. She had expected to witness a criminal transaction, perhaps even Isabel handing over the stolen treaty. Instead, she was watching an extortion attempt. Isabel's shoulders tensed. When she spoke again, her voice was like steel. "You wouldn't dare!" The man chuckled again. "Wouldn't I? I have very few moral qualms, Miss Gardner. You're intelligent. You wouldn't have come here if you weren't desperate to prevent embarrassment. The only question is, how far will you go to keep your secrets safe?" Jane's fingers curled into fists. What leverage did this man have over Isabel? What was she trying to keep hidden? For a moment, Jane considered revealing herself, stepping from the shadows to confront them both. But she hesitated. This was bigger than a single blackmail attempt. She needed more. Isabel inhaled slowly, her posture stiff but composed. "Give me more time." The man studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Midnight, tomorrow, same place, no more delays." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the mist. Isabel remained motionless for a moment, then exhaled, rubbing her temples before turning on her heel and walking swiftly away from the docks. Jane remained hidden until the echoes of her footsteps had faded. Then, and only then, did she step out into the open, her mind racing. Jane arrived back at Pendleton House in the early morning hours, her mind still processing what she had witnessed. Isabel had been at the docks, but she was not the thief. Yet that did not mean she was innocent. A blackmail attempt suggested that Isabel had been involved in something questionable, perhaps espionage, perhaps financial entanglements, perhaps something even more personal. Whatever it was, it had been serious enough to bring her to a midnight meeting. Jane's thoughts turned to the unknown man. He had spoken with confidence, with the air of someone who operated in the shadows. Was he connected to the stolen treaty, or had she stumbled upon an entirely separate crime running parallel to her investigation? Sitting by the fire in the drawing room, Jane reviewed her notes. Victor Halliday had been seen at the docks earlier, but was now missing. Isabel Gardner had been there as well, but had been the victim of blackmail rather than a conspirator. The stolen treaty was still unaccounted for. Someone powerful and unseen was manipulating events from the shadows. She let out a slow breath, staring into the flames. One thing was certain, this mystery was far from over. Tomorrow night she would return to the docks. Chapter 6. Unmasking the Hidden Hand. The docks had yielded more questions than answers. Isabel Gardner's blackmail, Victor Halliday's suspicious escape, and the ongoing mystery of the missing treaty. But one fact was becoming clearer. This was an inside job. Jane removed her hat and coat, handing them to the waiting butler before striding into Lord Pendleton's study. The nobleman sat at his grand mahogany desk, eyes weary from a sleepless night. "Any progress, Miss Parsons?" he asked, steepling his fingers. Jane placed her notebook on the desk. "I need to retrace every step of the night of the theft, every movement, every unlocked door, every creaking floorboard." Pendleton's brows knitted together. "I fear we've already accounted for everything." Jane shook her head. Not everything. The theft was too precise, no forced entry, no damage, yet the documents vanished from the vault. That means either the thief had access. She paused, or they didn't need it at all. She turned on her heel and strode toward the hall. "I need to see the layout of the house, every blueprint, every renovation, every hidden passage." Pendleton blinked. "Hidden passages?" Jane stopped in the doorway. "Every manor of this age has them. The question is, do you know about yours?" A full hour later, Jane found herself standing in the archives of Pendleton Manor, an old dimly lit chamber cluttered with aging blueprints, legal documents and estate records. With the help of Pendleton's reluctant but ever-efficient private secretary, Victor Halliday, who had returned in a rather bedraggled state that morning, claiming he had merely gone out for air, she sifted through the thick rolls of parchment. At first the plan seemed ordinary: a grand central hall, private wings for the family, a servants' quarter, and, of course, the vault room. But as she examined an older schematic, something caught her eye: a narrow passageway, one that no longer appeared in the modern blueprints. Jane unrolled another aged document, cross-referencing the passage's location. It led from the vault chamber directly into Lord Pendleton's study. She turned sharply to Pendleton. "Did you know about this?" He squinted at the parchment before his eyes widened in astonishment. I had no idea. These plans must be at least 70 years old. They were from my grandfather's time. The passage must have been sealed off decades ago." Jane's fingers traced the faint inked lines. Was it truly sealed, or had someone rediscovered it? She folded the blueprints and stood. "I need to examine your study again." Back in the study, Jane moved with careful precision, pressing along the wooden panelling, testing for irregularities. She knew that old passageways were often concealed behind bookshelves, fireplaces, or decorative panelling. Her fingers traced the ornate carvings along the bookshelf closest to the desk. Was it just an elaborate design, or a mechanism? Then a faint shift, a give in the wood. Jane pressed harder. A soft click sounded almost imperceptible. With a slow creak, the section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow corridor beyond. Dust floated in the air, disturbed for the first time in who knew how long. Pendleton sucked in a sharp breath. Good Lord! Jane stepped inside. The air was damp and stale, the scent of old wood and neglect thick around her. Holding her lantern aloft, she moved cautiously, tracing the tunnel's path. The walls were lined with aged stone, and the passage sloped downward, curving ever so slightly. Moments later, she reached the end of the tunnel. Another concealed door. The back wall of the vault. Someone had used this passage recently. Jane crouched, running her fingers along the floor. The layer of dust had been disturbed in a perfect line of footprints leading away from the vault. Someone had known about this passage. Someone had walked this very route on the night of the theft. Back in the study, Jane turned to face Pendleton and Halliday. "This passage was used," she said. "The thief never needed to force their way into the vault because they didn't enter through the front door. They came from inside the house." Halliday looked pale. But who could have known about this passage? I certainly didn't." Jane's mind was racing. Who among the suspects could have discovered this hidden way in? Victor Halliday. As the private secretary, he handled documents and estate records. Had he stumbled across the passage in an old record? Eleanor Fitzroy, raised in the house. Had she found the secret as a child? Could she have used it now? Major Blake, a military man adept at strategy. Could he have been tipped off to its existence? Isabel Gardner, connected to international circles? Had she been given inside knowledge from someone else? Jane turned back to the passage, narrowing her eyes. She had found how the treaty had been stolen. Now she needed to find out who had stolen it, and most importantly, who had they stolen it for? As she stepped back from the passageway, a thought struck her. The thief had used this hidden corridor to remove the treaty from the vault. But where did they take it next? Her gaze fell to Lord Pendleton's desk. If the tunnel led directly here, had the thief hidden it in plain sight before smuggling it out? She strode to the desk and began examining every drawer, every compartment. Then her fingers brushed over a shallow false bottom in one of the drawers. Jane pressed. It popped open. But there was no treaty inside. Instead, there was an old key tied with a faded ribbon. She lifted it carefully, turning it over in her hand. Pendleton's face darkened as he stared at it. That belongs to an old guest chamber. It hasn't been used in years." Jane's pulse quickened. Had the missing treaty been hidden there? Or had it already been taken by someone who knew she was closing in? There was only one way to find out. Without another word, she turned and strode toward the east wing of the manor. The case was unraveling, and Jane was ready for the final reveal. Chapter 7. The Truth Revealed. Jane held the faded ribbon-bound key in her palm. The missing Anglo-American submarine treaty had been smuggled out of the vault through the hidden passageway, and if her deductions were correct, it had been hidden in this very room. Her mind raced through the puzzle pieces that had led her to this moment: the hidden tunnel, the footprints in the dust, the blackmail of Isabel Gardner, Victor Halliday's escape, and the secret meeting at the docks. It had all been orchestrated by someone who had moved unseen, someone who knew the house better than anyone else. Someone like Samuel Greer, the trusted butler of Pendleton Manor. Jane's grip tightened around the key. It was time for the truth to come to light. Jane turned the key in the lock, the mechanism clicking open with unsettling ease. Pushing the door inward, she stepped into a dimly lit room covered in dust sheets. But one thing was out of place. A mahogany writing desk stood uncovered, its surface free of dust, as though someone had used it recently. She moved swiftly, her eyes scanning for any sign of the treaty. And then, in a hollowed-out compartment beneath the desk's drawer, she found it, a bundle of carefully folded, official-looking documents bound in red ribbon bearing the seal of the British government. The missing treaty. Jane exhaled, her fingers brushing the parchment. It had been hidden here all along. A noise from behind made her turn. Standing in the doorway, his face a careful mask of neutrality, was Samuel Greer, the butler. "I had a feeling you would find your way here, Miss Parsons," he said calmly. Jane's eyes narrowed. "You've been at this house longer than any of the suspects, yet you remained conveniently in the background. But you made one mistake, Greer." He tilted his head, feigning polite curiosity. "Oh? And what might that be?" "You knew about the hidden passage. It's been forgotten by the family for decades. And yet, someone used it to steal the treaty. Only someone with an intimate knowledge of the house's old design could have discovered it, someone who spent years tending to its halls." A slow, rueful smile spread across Greer's face. "Very astute, Detective." Jane took a measured step forward, keeping her voice even. "It wasn't about money for you. It wasn't even about espionage. This was revenge." A flicker of something dark passed through his eyes, but he remained silent. Jane continued. "You grew up in service to powerful men, watching them make decisions that shaped the world while your family lived in the shadows. And when you learned that this treaty would strengthen England's position, you saw your opportunity to strike a blow against the very system that oppressed your father, your brothers, your past." Greer's mask slipped, his jaw tightening. "And what does England's position matter, Miss Parsons?" he asked, his voice quieter now, laced with something raw. "Has it mattered to the families that starve in the slums? To the men sent to war to protect the interests of the wealthy? This treaty, like all treaties, serves only those who already hold power." Jane studied him carefully. There was conviction in his words, but also bitterness, resentment built over years of quiet servitude. "You intended to destroy it," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Not sell it, not use it for leverage. You simply wanted to erase it from existence." Greer's lips twitched into a humourless smile. "You assume I haven't already." Jane held up the bundle of documents. "But you failed." For the first time his composure faltered, just for a second. Jane's voice sharpened. "You planned to frame others. First Victor Halliday, then Major Blake, then even Isabel Gardner through blackmail. You ensured the blame would fall on anyone but yourself. Greer exhaled, shaking his head. And I almost succeeded. He took a step forward. Jane's muscles tensed, but before he could make another move, the sound of approaching footsteps filled the hall. Lord Pendleton and Major Blake entered the room, flanked by 2 uniformed constables. Greer's gaze flicked to them, his lips pressing into a thin line. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head ever so slightly. It appears the game is over. You never had a chance of winning, Greer, Jane said. Not against me. For a long moment, Greer simply stood there, his hands by his sides. Then, without resistance, he allowed the constables to step forward and restrain him. As they led him from the room, he turned his head slightly and murmured, "You see the world too cleanly, Miss Parsons. One day you may realize that justice is not always so simple." And then he was gone. Back in Lord Pendleton's study, Jane placed the treaty on his desk. The nobleman stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at her. "You saved not just my reputation, Detective," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You preserved stability between nations. This document is critical to England's security." Jane merely inclined her head. "The truth always finds its way to the surface, Lord Pendleton." Major Blake exhaled, shaking his head. "I'd never have suspected Greer. He was always so unassuming." Jane allowed herself a small smile. "It is often the ones we overlook who hold the deepest secrets." Pendleton straightened. "Miss Parsons, you have my gratitude, and I suspect the government will also wish to recognise your work." Jane merely smiled. "I require no recognition, my lord, only the satisfaction of a mystery solved." As she stepped toward the window, the morning light began to stream in over the London skyline, golden and clear. The treaty was safe, the culprit unmasked, and Detective Jane Parsons, once again, had proven herself as England's sharpest detective. Epilogue: A new mystery beckons. As Jane prepared to leave Pendleton Manor, a footman intercepted her with a small sealed envelope. "A message just arrived for you, Miss Parsons." Jane took the letter, breaking the wax seal. Inside was a single line, scrawled in neat, deliberate handwriting. "There are greater secrets buried in the shadows of London than you yet realise. We will meet again." There was no signature. Jane's eyes darkened with curiosity. A new mystery awaited, and she was ready.